Today's World Insight. Joe Biden's inauguration, an unusual U.S. transition of power in extraordinarily tough times. What does the change in leadership mean for America and the world? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and this is World Insight coming to you live from Beijing. We begin today's program with the U.S. presidential inauguration, the beginning of Joe Biden's administration, and curtains for Donald Trump. Mr. Biden faces spiraling COVID deaths and the tall order of uniting a deeply polarized nation. The inauguration takes place on Capitol Hill, the very spot where the pro-Trump mob stormed Congress 2 weeks ago. Mr. Trump bid farewell in a video address on Tuesday and made 11th-hour pardons and commutations. It's been a bumpy ride for Mr. Trump in the past 4 years, leaving the legacy of a runaway pandemic, a tanking economy, and a divisive foreign policy. And he will go down in the U.S. history as the president who faced the charges of a deadly insurrection and got impeached twice.
What we've done has been amazing by any standard. We were not a regular administration.
For more on the U.S. presidential inauguration and Trump's quote-unquote legacy, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Zhou Bo, a senior fellow of the Center of International Security and Strategy with Tsinghua University, also former director of the Center for Security Cooperation with the Chinese Ministry of National Defense. Meanwhile, joining us here in the studio, Professor Jia Qingguo, professor and former dean of the School of International Studies from Peking University. And joining us from New York via Skype, Daniel Russell, Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. He's also former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs under the Obama administration. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. This is a big day, certainly, for recent history of the United States. Mr. Russell, I'm sure you want to share some of your insights and certainly feelings for the day.
Well, thanks for having me, Tian Wei. And it's great to be with good friends. Look, this is a big day. This is a happy day. It's a day of relief because some normalcy is being restored to the U.S. political system.
Well, how long will we be able to celebrate? That really depends on what's likely to be agenda. So, Senior Colonel Zhou, tell me more about how do you see the complicated situation a new administration is going to face?
Well, I think this is a really exceptional day in that President who actually is impeached twice is gone. And the oldest man who will ever enter the White House is coming in. And for Chinese who have been watching the situation in the United States and thinking of the troubled and ever intense relationship between China-US, this is really significant and somewhat funny.
It is a significant day for the world, if you look at the recent history over the past 4 years. Professor Jia, your thoughts?
Well, this is a very important day. Finally, President Trump is gone, and Mr. Biden is in. During the past 4 years, the world went through a lot. The U.S. went through a lot. And it was a big mess. and there is a lot of expectation that the new administration would do something to change the situation, to get the U.S. foreign policy back to the track again.
We'll see whether that's going to happen in an efficient manner. Having said that, though, before we talk about the new, let's review the old. What does it say to us, so-called the Trump era and the Trumpism, to you, Mr. Russell?
Well, I mean, Trump and Trumpism embraced a very nasty and nativist approach to the world. And Trump in particular, as president, who was a very flawed president, gave permission to angry white supremacists and other extremists to openly express their views, and that has been destabilizing. So having unleashed those forces, empowered that mob, now American society needs to calm down, put those views and people back on the fringe, and to reestablish a centrist sense of what's acceptable behavior. And I think this has been a stress test for the American democratic system, and today we can breathe a sigh of relief because we've passed the test, although not exactly with flying colors. Trump was decisively defeated in the election. He's leaving office in the normal manner. This wasn't the Cultural Revolution, but it was a serious disruption of American society. But I think we're seeing now great resilience, stability in the institutions and society. But it's certainly going to take time and effort to normalize the political environment.
Professor Jia, Mr. Trump, just several hours ago, has been suggesting that he will come back, quote unquote, in different ways. We do not know exactly what he meant as usual. But how much danger do you see that Trumpism is still going to have its way in the United States, in a quite divided country?
Well, I think Trump himself may be discredited to some extent, but a lot of things he stands for are still there. I think some of them are a reflection of the inability to solve structural domestic problems on the part of the US. Unless those problems, like polarization, racism, are to some extent managed appropriately, I think Trumpism will be, what Trump stands for will be there. And he has a large following, like 74 million people. So that's a big challenge to the new administration, how to address their concerns, how to unite the country.
Unity exactly is the key word, I guess, for the inauguration ceremony of Mr. Biden as the president. But Senior Colonel Joe, tell me more about how do you see Trumpism and why it triumphed in the U.S., at least for several years?
Well, it's interesting for you to mention this word Trumpism because actually I read something different. John Bolton, the former national security advisor, actually disagree. There is such a thing as a Trumpism because he says this guy doesn't. This is a man. If you just draw a doubt among all the things he said, you can't find a philosophy in it. To some extent, I agree. Yeah, because he said his instinct is so good, right? He just rules by instinct. So, but on the other hand, we do see something he has left. He has a lot of legacy left, right? A divided United States, with all the support Professor Jia mentioned, the country is almost neatly divided into two halves, and this, of course, leads to another question: what do you call unity? I was thinking. Probably Joe Biden was in a similar situation as Abraham Lincoln. Why? Because after Civil War, Lincoln faces a war waiting to be healed, but he has no enemy because the war is already over.
Yeah.
But Biden still would have to heal a nation, but he has to first of all fight the enemies from within with such large, horrendous following of President Trump.
That's for the incoming president. But on the other hand, I remember very well, Mr. Russell, you recently held a dialogue with two former Secretary of States. One is Secretary of State Schultz, and the other is the National Security Advisor Kissinger. They both talk about the realities of U.S. today. Particularly, Mr. Kissinger said the American exceptionalism may not be there anymore in the hearts of many around the world. So your thoughts about what Trump's legacy exactly is for your country?
Well, first, I think that Donald Trump showed Americans something very worrisome and frankly ugly in our society, racism and nativism, of victimhood mentality. And I don't believe there are 74 million Americans who actually support those attributes. I think that it's a much smaller fringe who truly embrace those elements of Trump. What Trump leaves behind, above all else, frankly, is 400,000 Americans who have died from the coronavirus. He refused to accept the reality of the disease. He never moved to take the necessary action. And look, I mean, it's human nature not to want to hear bad news. There were problems in the first week after the reports of the virus began to emerge from Wuhan as well, China. But the Chinese government did ultimately spring into decisive action. Donald Trump didn't, and Americans really paid a big price for that.
Go ahead, Mr. Zhou.
Well, I think Daniel Russell really made a very good point. And when you talk about Americans' exceptionalism, I believe it's good for them to realize they're not so exceptional because they even call themselves indispensable. But the United States, like the rest of the world, is just an equal member of the international community. It's good for them to realize they're not living in a city upon the hill.
Is it back to reality, Professor Jia?
To a lot of people, what happened in the last 4 years was a lot of disappointment, especially for those who admire and aspire to look toward the U.S., look up toward the U.S. A lot of disappointment, but of course there are a lot of people still hope that Biden would revive the old America again. But that's probably wishful thinking because the world has changed. The U.S. has to adapt to the new realities. It will be exceptional in different ways, but it will never be the same again.
Very interesting. We're going to explore how the new administration is likely to deal with the realities and, as you said, adjust to the realities. You're watching World Insight. The program is coming to you live from Beijing. Coming up, can the new U.S. president manage to bridge the political divide and accomplish his agenda in his first 100 days in the office? Stay tuned. Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The Biden administration is taking the reins of a bitterly divided country. That did not stop him from promising some big changes upon taking office. His top priority: curb coronavirus infections, speed up the vaccine rollout, reform immigration, deal with climate change, and save the U.S. economy. Last week, Mr. Biden unveiled a $1.9 trillion economic relief package known as, quote, the American Rescue Plan, which will need a nod from Congress and comes as a pandemic winter surge in the U.S. breaks records.
I'd like to talk to you about our way forward, a two-step plan of rescue and recovery. Tonight, I'll lay out my first step, the American Rescue Plan, that will tackle the pandemic and get direct financial assistance and relief to Americans who need it the most. Next month, in my first appearance before a joint session of Congress, I will lay out my Build Back Better recovery plan.
For more on the Biden administration's 100 days, we are joined once again in the Beijing studio, Zhou Bo, Jia Qingguo, and Daniel Russell joining us from New York. Mr. Russell, go to you once again first. A lot on the agenda, 100 days, very ambitious. Given a divided political environment, how well do you think President Biden will be able to navigate?
Well, Tianwei, you've described many of the big challenges that he faces at home as well as overseas. The international reputation of the United States is badly diminished, and countries are waiting to see if the United States can stage a comeback. But following Donald Trump is, in a way, a very low bar. People in the United States, and I think the world, is weary of the erratic behavior, the drama of the Trump era. Joe Biden has unmatched experience in government, in legislating after all his years in the Senate. He had the experience of engineering dramatic economic recovery to the United States back in 2009 when he was first elected vice president. And he's got a temperament, personal empathy. He's suffered immense tragedy in his life that I think stand him in good stead in dealing with the challenges in U.S. society. He's got a very professional, very experienced team around him. And look, I think the world is longing for an America that they can, again, depend on. So I think Biden knows what he's got to do. He will approach the challenges with a sense of humility. Right. He's the man for the moment.
Many of the voters went to the polls with the belief that they do not want to choose Donald Trump, but rather the other person. So apparently, Mr. Biden, given his experience and all his approaches during the campaign, is the other person that many chose. But he also needs to establish himself. How much do you think he will be able to do that? Will the cutting point of vaccination be the one for Mr. Biden to establish himself as a really dependable leader at a crucial time? Mr. Russell, briefly.
Yeah, I think as big as the challenge is, it's hard for me to think of another politician who is as ready and well equipped to meet this challenge as Joe Biden. It's an uphill battle, but he's been impressive during the campaign. He's been impressive during the transition, dealing with pretty outrageous behavior by Trump and the mob. So yeah, I think he's demonstrated the skills and steadiness that he's going to need to succeed.
According to CNN, on his very first day in the office, Mr. Biden plans to issue 17 executive actions, from directing the COVID pandemic response to canceling the controversial Keystone XL pipelines. 8 of the 17 actions directly reverse the Trump policies, such as rejoining the WHO, the Paris Climate Accord, reversing restrictions on U.S. entry for Muslim-majority countries, and halting construction of the border wall. Very ambitious list of tasks to be finished. Tell me more, Mr. Zhou, about how do you see Mr. Biden will be able to use Mr. Trump, his predecessor, as a rallying factor when his approach in the political way to get the first 100 days ambition done?
Well, that's an interesting question, because if we look at the task faced by Joe Biden, I would conclude his main priority is domestic issue. Then if we come to the foreign policy, there are some low-hanging fruits. For example, what you have already mentioned, the Paris Climate Change Accord and the WHO, which actually can be finished with just one announcement. The more challenging issues are, for example, the Iranian nuclear issues, which after so many years, Iran definitely would raise the bargaining chips. It won't be as easy as it was before. And then, of course, the DPRK is a difficult issue, but the most difficult issue probably is the China-US relationship. This is Trump's legacy, which is endorsed by bipartisan consensus. Therefore, Biden can hardly thwart it because it's already backed by bipartisan consensus. But he actually can do something exceptional in that, because Trump administration has already led this relationship into a free fall. Therefore, Biden can just do the opposite by shoring it up. But I don't know how high it will be. It takes two to tango. It takes his great efforts and cooperative efforts from the Chinese government.
Professor Jia, your thought?
Well, I agree. I think Biden faces a lot of challenges. But during the past few weeks after the election, Trump's efforts to reverse the election result have totally discredited him to a significant extent. So this give more room for Biden to reverse Trump's previous policies. And also, I agree with Dan Russell that Biden has experience. And also, the past few weeks, his handling of the crisis of Trump's efforts to overturn the election results show that he's moderate and decisive, and also very rational and very pragmatic in handling all these kind of challenges.
Right.
So Biden also has advantage. That is, he has appointed a lot of very experienced people to help him. So these are the talents of the American elite, and they are experienced both domestic issues and also international affairs.
And a lot of them actually have been interacting with China over the decades.
Right.
For example, the Secretary of State Blinken, and also the Treasury Secretary Yellen, and several of the others as well. So, Mr. Russell, tell me more about what do you make of this team Biden is building? He is important, but the team is even more, particularly regarding foreign policy, such as direction towards China.
Well, I completely agree with Professor Jia and Senior Colonel Zhou. These are people with immense direct experience in government. They understand how government works. They also understand how to make government work. They're battle-hardened, so to speak. They know each other. They have worked together, so there'll be good teamwork. And one of the most important features is that these are all people who Joe Biden trusts. Tony Blinken has been close to Biden since early days in the Senate. So they know how Biden thinks. He's prepared to delegate a considerable amount of authority to them. There'll be teamwork again in the U.S. government, and I think that that bodes very well for the handling of national security issues.
Some of the people, actually, Mr. Russell, you work very closely with, talking about the China policy particularly. For example, Mr. Campbell, who you succeeded earlier as the Assistant Secretary of State in dealing with East Asian affairs. So, Mr. Russell, what do you make of the current talks about by these officials, administration officials, toward China policy? Any message you have picked up? How do you think people could better judge the future directions of this policy, Mr. Russell?
Well, I think that we can already see that this is not a group that operates by slogans. And there isn't an ideological mission or label that's going to define their approach to China. They're, as I said, experienced, they're pragmatic, they're also patriots. And perhaps the theme that's most prominent is the recognition that above all else, first and foremost, the United States needs to get its own act together, that we need to renew and strengthen the foundation of American international influence, of our own national security. That means building back better our economy. It means investing in infrastructure, means promoting innovation, and so on. And so I don't think that the group that is around Joe Biden sees foreign policy as something separate from domestic renewal. They're talking about a foreign policy that benefits and serves the interests of U.S. citizens, of the middle class. So that integration of foreign policy and domestic policy, I think, means that they will move slowly, they'll move strategically, but they will make real progress.
Very interesting. I pick up the word. Mr. Russell suggests about, quote, influence, while the other two Chinese guests in your earlier comments talk about U.S. needs to adapt. So there is a very interesting diversion of how you see what the future is going to be like. Senior Colonel Zhou.
Well, I think politically it lies in whether China-US relationship is a relationship for cooperation, competition, or competition, right? If it is competition, then what is the ratio between the two? Because the Chinese government still talk about cooperation, and when the Chinese government talk about no confrontation, no conflict, it actually has indirectly admitted there is an element of competition in there. But you have to let from Chinese point of view, you have to let the cooperation prevail over competition, and in the worst case, do not let the competition sliding into confrontation. So I think the tariff war, trade war is a typical example. If we look at the recently concluded China-EU investment agreement, isn't a similar agreement between China and US much better than the tariff war, which made the United States no winner at all, right? They have, according to Oxford Economics, they have lost 732,000 jobs, and they do not necessarily have an upper hand. Why should they do that? And in terms of military relationship, of course, this is one of the very few areas that China and the United States have some kind of a consensus. That is not to have a confrontation, and we must manage risk reduction. So this is a very interesting point.
So it's a very interesting layers of questions, Professor Jia. It seems that fundamentally, what's going to be the approaches both sides used toward one another when it comes to this general development of a relationship. Secondly, over the past few years, the dialogues, communications between China and the United States, including the one that you are doing about people-to-people exchanges, have pretty much collapsed and or paralyzed. So without mending the garden, as they say, or tending the garden, how will China-US relationship be able to develop? So Professor Jia, how do you see this totally new list of tasks that China-US have to do together, this different layer of things, all at the same time, Professor?
Well, first of all, I think at the strategic level, I think we should return to some kind of a rational approach. As far as the U.S. is concerned, probably it should return to the U.S. international strategy before Trump. Okay? That is to work with other countries to make maintain international order in order to protect American interests. And of course, in this is the strategy that helps that serves the interests of the U.S., the hegemon, the leading power. And if this is the strategy, then it's the U.S. interest to make good use of China's resources to help the U.S. to maintain the international order. As far as China is concerned, even though China is not a leading superpower, China has been trying to make good use of U.S. resources to advance its own interests. And of course, even if China becomes a superpower, China also needs to maintain international order, and in doing so, it will seek U.S. help to maintain the international order. So the two countries' fundamental interests are not that different. Okay, so at that level, there is a huge room for cooperation.
Mr. Russell, do you think the two countries will be able to, at least under this administration, the new administration, know how to work together and find the boundaries and even the framework? Is it too much to ask?
No, I think both countries, as a general matter, do know how to do this and see various advantages in engineering a credible and meaningful record of both cooperation and compromise. So I think Professor Zhang made some important insights. What I would add is that, look, the world really has changed in the last 4 years. The United States has changed. China has changed. So it's not simply a matter of turning the clock back. And there are real differences in terms of the way that the United States and China perceive the future international order. So these are things that need to be worked through. It's going to have to be a joint project, frankly, between leaders in Washington and Beijing. I think there's no alternative but for them to do the hard work of rebuilding trust and shifting attitudes towards the other side. And that means, look, not just picking an area and saying, okay, let's cooperate on this. Let's find a win-win outcome. We have to show that we can handle areas of disagreement. We can show that we can manage friction points in a way that prevents them from heating up and risking a crisis. And we need to show that we can compete in a manner that's healthy and not in a destructive rivalry.
All of these need to be implemented, and I guess it has to start from somewhere, probably from a lot of places. I'm sure they will have more insights about all of this coming up in our program. You're watching World Insight, coming to you from Beijing. How will the U.S. relations with China likely play out under the Biden administration? That's next, right after the break. China-U.S. relations have been trapped in a vicious cycle for a long time as Joe Biden takes office as a chance for the two countries to work together on the pandemic and economic recovery. And of course, the list of cooperation could also go on. Looking ahead, the Chinese President Xi Jinping called on a former Starbucks executive to help get China-U.S. relations back on the cooperative track, at least from the business perspective. He was responding to a letter from former Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz, who congratulated China on its achievement in building a moderately prosperous society. And then I got an exclusive statement from Mr. Schultz and Starbucks company in response to President Xi's message, saying the company will continue to build common ground for cooperation between the two countries, China and the United States. So, likely China policy under the Biden administration. Once again, we're joined by our guests, Jia Qingguo, Zhou Bo, and Daniel Russell. Professor Jia, since we earlier talked about China-U.S. relations, so there are a lot of political headwinds in the U.S., as we have noticed over the past few years, that statements with reasons and numbers sometimes would not even get across. For example, about the nature of trade between China and the United States. I really remember there were enormous amount of graphics that people could look into about the nature of this trade relationship. But the rhetorics certainly won over the real pictures. Professor Jia, are we going to see this change even with this new administration?
I think Biden administration probably would deal with the trade issue quite differently. First, probably it will not make up things or tell or misinformation, spread misinformation, as the Trump administration did. And secondly, it will probably look at the trade issue from an economist perspective as well as political perspective. So take a more rational approach in terms of promoting, maximizing interests of, of the U.S. If that happens, then we're not going to see the trade wars that the Trump administration unleashed. And probably we are going to see a gradual phase down of the trade tariffs that President Trump imposed.
I see. Mr. Russell, though, that has a lot to do with what you suggested, Mr. Russell, about whether the U.S. will be able to handle the so-called domestic issue with its approaches to other countries. I remember, once again, your conversation with Mr. Schultz, who suggested the China-U.S. trade deficit is not a strategic issue. It's a mathematic issue because U.S. just produced less than it could consume. And therefore, we'll have trade deficit with other countries. China is one of them. That's just the one argument. But overall, do you think the relationship will be able to have more logic than the political headwinds?
Yeah, I think there's a strong logic behind cooperation, and that, as George Schultz pointed out, there's some arithmetic involved in handling trade-related problems, but our problems don't stop there. We have technological competition, and what's, I think, much more dangerous, we have geostrategic friction across the Taiwan Strait in the South China Sea. These frictions have intensified at the very moment that the channels of communication and crisis prevention have shut down. The good news is that Donald Trump's Twitter account is shut down, that Mike Pompeo is gone, and he took his megaphone speeches denouncing China with him. Now it's time for the Chinese side to pull back its wolf warriors and concentrate on figuring out ways for us to, at a minimum, coexist and hopefully to manage our differences effectively. Naturally, we can and should expect the Biden administration to seek cooperation in areas where our interests overlap, but I want to really underscore cooperation alone won't restore stability to the U.S.-China relationship. We have got to deal with the areas where we have real differences, and that's going to have to be more than just agreeing to disagree.
Senior Colonel Zhou, your thoughts?
Well, I'm happy that Russell has finally come to the issue of South China Sea and the Taiwan issue, because this Trump administration has really changed the Obama administration's policies in this regard, and the situation across Taiwan Strait in particular is becoming more and more dangerous, because Secretary of State Pompeo actually is more than a maverick. He had deliberately smashed all the windows and make it extremely difficult for Biden administration to do anything, because he has scrapped all the rules as regulations.
Yeah.
The question is, why would he do that in the last few days? In that, you read the integrity, you read the character of this man. He's not a man of integrity. This definitely is not on moral ground, to say the least. Because of the importance of such an issue to China, and because of the fact that Joe Biden and his team know China so well, it's my sincere hope that he will handle this issue very carefully.
Professor Jia?
I think it's quite unfortunate that Americans tend to believe that the Trump administration spread lies and misinformation at home, but they seem to not to pay too much attention of that administration's efforts to spread lies and misinformation abroad. I think on the China issue, the Trump administration came up with a lot of lies and misinformation as well. So I think during the Trump administration, Washington was in an emotional anti-China approach, state. I hope that after Biden comes in, the situation will be better as more accurate and objective information are available.
You know, it's mind-boggling, Mr. Russell, for me to think about it, where to begin with. I mean, after all, 4 years of lack of communication, destroying of dialogues and also exchanges, where to begin with? And who is there to extend the olive branch? What is being considered as constructive by the other side so that relationship and discussions can be built upon? All these are mind-boggling questions to me, a journalist. I don't know, strategic thinkers like you and your colleagues now in the administration, do you have a way out? Do you have already a blueprint or something like that?
Well, not a blueprint per se, but I think that common sense can be our guide. I mean, I think Senior Colonel Joe and Professor Jad made some great points. I think, an approach to problems that focuses on the search for a way forward, problem solving as opposed to finger pointing and denouncing the other side. I think injecting a measure of respect in the dialogue about and with the other side. Look, our two governments know perfectly well how to communicate directly, privately, effectively, how to work on problem solving. One thing that each of us can, and I think needs to do, is to be mindful of the atmosphere, public sentiment in the other nation, and make sure that we're not inadvertently or deliberately inflaming public sentiment in the other country, and to the contrary, doing the things that we can to try to create a political environment that makes it easier both for the White House and for decision makers in Zhongnanhai to take constructive steps to make the right decisions. There are a lot of areas where our interests overlap and we can cooperate. But the extent of that cooperation, and more pressingly, the way in which we compete and the way in which we deal with areas of disagreement is going to be enhanced or inhibited by the attitudes of our public. So getting public sentiment back to a stable, calm, and constructive place ought to be a starting point.
Stable, calm, and constructive place. I took a lot of notes out of the conversation you guys had. A really important day for not only the United States, but for many others who need to work with the U.S., hopefully, for a better world. Final words, I hope every one of you can share with us. What is your biggest hope from now on about U.S. country and also about China-U.S. relations? One sentence from every one of you. Senior Colonel Zhou.
Well, I just repeat what I said. I hope he can actually move in the opposite direction to bring the relationship that is already in a free fall back to normalcy.
Okay. Professor Jia.
I hope the two countries can quickly resume dialogues and consultation again.
Including people-to-people relations,
Of
and
course.
the students and the professors, and Mr. Russell.
Well, I hope that the United States and China, instead of talking past each other, learn to listen to one another and to use what they hear to build a stable and constructive relationship.
I know you guys are listening to each other when you were talking, and I hope this is a fruitful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Daniel Russell, Jia Qingguo, Zhou Bo, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have for today's program. In fact, in our Thursday and Friday's programs, we are still going to continue our discussion about the new changes in administration. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Bye for now.